Universal power modifiers, essential to any aspiring arcane background user, and there's a lot of kind of rules ambiguity and a lot of nuance to their use, so we're really going to get deep into it. I summon a choral musical intro!
Savage World, one of the best games today. Savage World, Benny and Hands.
Welcome back, Savages. I hope you're still here with me after that embarrassing display I did. But yeah, this is Tabletop Tango. I'm your host, Eric. Please like, subscribe, cast bolt at all those buttons. We really, really appreciate hearing back from people. It really makes us keep going. We're not a huge channel, but we just love the game and we just love hearing back from people. So yeah, anyways, today we're talking about universal modifications. They are a hallmark of Savage Worlds power systems. And I definitely think that they're underutilized and sometimes even forgotten, especially by new players or people who are new to arcane backgrounds, in Savage Worlds. I see them getting forgotten. Because what are modifiers, power modifiers? Well, power modifiers are little extras that you can put onto your powers that change it in some way or add something in some way that costs a couple of extra power points. Like bolt power, for example, you can add more damage to it, or the barrier power you can make stronger, like the wall you can make stronger. Those are all specific to those powers. Universal power modifiers are ones that can be applied to a lot of different powers, and they kind of do more generic things. But there is a lot of, sometimes their use, it's a little confusing with some of them, and there's a little bit of nuance to when you should use them or not use them, or how are they, if they're worth it to even use in some situations. So I'm really going to get into it a lot. And, I am mainly an arcane background guy. If I'm playing a character, I usually want to be playing a character that has some type of arcane background. That's just how I like playing, and I love the power system in Savage World. So yeah, I've always loved using them. Now, as a caveat, there is some weird rule stuff with their application. I really went into like old forum posts, old developer diaries, and tried to get as many official rulings as I can, but really it's going to come down to your game master and game master fiat and, creativity, and every game master is going to be different whether they will allow something or not. So don't take anything super hard and fast, but I'll try to give the definitive kind of rulings that as I see them. I'm also going to rank them, and this is just, mainly I like it as fun, but it's supposed to just, it's going to just kind of, for newer players that kind of give an overall value to them. And I usually do, the classic S to F kind of ranking system, S being just something that you want to use all the time. That's super powerful, always works. A is another one that's very strong, but it's not something that's just all the time. B is something that has a little bit more nuance to it. C is going to be something that is still can be good, but just is much more niche or specific. D is when you start getting into the ones that are like hardly ever worth it, and F are just garbage completely. So yeah, that's just something I like doing. Let's get into it. So the first thing to know about universal power modifiers is how long do they last? Because with normal power modifiers, they're just it's intrinsic within the power. More damage just adds on more damage. The greater strength of the barrier, right? It just lasts for the duration of the barrier. So the most important thing to remember here is that if there's two different types of durations. I guess, in powers. There's ones that have a duration, usually 5 rounds. That's the normal. That's the average for most of the powers. Or there's instant powers. Instant powers are ones that do something right away and that's it. So with universal power modifiers, they either last for the duration of that power that you add them onto, or they last until the target's next turn, at the end of the next turn. Kind of like distracted or vulnerable. Now, the thing that might get a little confusing here for people is that there's actually a lot of instant powers that have an effect that lasts longer than just one round. As an example, stun. Stun is an instant power, and so the power itself just does one thing and then it's over, but the condition of stunned can can go on for multiple rounds until the unfortunate stunned target is, gets out of it. So that's the one thing to kind of consider, is that even though stuns could last a long time, when, if you throw on a universal power modifier, it's not going to last for the whole time they're stunned. It just lasts until the end of their next turn. So that's the really, really important thing to realize about the durations. But yeah, let's get into the kind of specifics now. So at the very top is armor piercing. Now this is another one that has kind of I guess some ambiguity with the rules. Luckily, with this one, I found a forum post where Clint, one of the head developers at Savage Worlds, who we've had the opportunity to meet before in one of our videos with Carl, he actually answered. He was the rules guy for a long time, the kind of rules authority. And the question with armor piercing, well, what does it do? It basically adds on armor piercing to a damaging power, like Bolt, right? It's 1 power point for 2 AP, 2 power points for 4 AP, and 3 power points for 6 armor piercing. Armor piercing, just to remind anybody, is when you do damage against somebody, it deducts that amount of armor. So if a creature had, 8 toughness and 2 of it was from armor, if you had 2 armor piercing, you would negate the 2 armor, so it'd only be considered 6 toughness. So basically it can be added on to a damaging power. So that makes sense with things like Bolt and Blast. But what about things like Smite and, other things that might have damage in them? Well, Clint answered that, and basically anything that does damage, it's kosher to do. So you can add on armor piercing onto Smite, and then when somebody does damage with a Smite, if they have +2 damage on their sword, and you add on the armor piercing, AP2, they'll have +2 damage and +2 armor piercing. So he actually answered that. So that allows us to do stuff like anything with damage, right? So we got like damage field, and we have things like if you do the barrier mod if you do the damage mod on barrier, that should allow like your, say if it's a wall of vines, your kind of thorns to have armor piercing on them, right? So that really opens it up. So that's the first kind of ruling on that. So let's actually talk specifically about how you want to use this. Armor piercing, generally, it's okay. When the things have armor, it is basically just a damage increase, much like Smite, right? If something has 2 armor and you're using armor piercing 2, that's basically the same as having 2 extra damage. The tricky part here is that it's useless when the things don't have armor, or you use too much armor piercing over the armor value of the target. And that's when you can waste power points. And in all of these kind of power modifiers, we're only talking about 1, 2, at the max 3 power points to be used on your powers. And that might not seem a lot, but when you're in protracted battles, which I've certainly been in plenty of times, and you're an arcane caster and that's your whole shtick, the 1 and the 2 power points can really add up. And, power points are your lifeline. So it is good to kind of think about that, especially when we talk about armor piercing. So the 1 PowerPoint version, the 2 AP, is cheaper than the damage mod found in damage powers. But the damage mod and damage powers, like in Bolt, it's 2 power points to basically give it another die. A D6 damage die is going to be, on average, much more damage than just a +2 on 1 hit, right? At least 3.5 is the average. So it is a dice, but on average, you'll get that more damage, usually. So really, when you're talking about armor piercing, I think it's generally safe. Just stick to the 1 PowerPoint version. And it's really, really effective on Smite, and it's really, really effective on like damage field and things like barrier. So especially Smite, just because you can give a big strength to your damage dealer tank. Now, as far as like adding on more armor piercing, like it can still be good. The first thing to do is just to like kind of when you're facing off with enemies is to ask your GM, what are you seeing? Now, I think I'm not gonna say a good game master, but most game masters should probably not, cause you an action to kind of figure out what's going on. I mean, most of the time you can just kind of see if somebody's wearing armor like chainmail or leather, or if a creature has, really tough scales or a shell or something. If it's something that's more futuristic or hidden, then obviously you might need a roll, but usually you can kind of tell. I really went through bestiaries to get kind of just like averages, or just kind of see what was out there as far as armor values on creatures that are in official books. Most of the creatures that you'll face off, again, they usually actually have toughness over armor. That's kind of the more general thing that they go with. And sometimes it's not always the same. Like golems will have armor, but elementals don't have armor, like an earth elemental, right? They just have toughness. So it's sometimes a little confusing, but excuse me. Most of the time, most armored creatures will only have between 1 and 2 armor. And this is stuff when you're looking at like a monster that have like scales, like a crocodile has scales. I think that has 1 or 2 armor. Thick skin, like from a troll, something that would just be really, really tough skinned would have armor. And then something that has like a carapace or a shell. So something like a giant turtle, right? Or a giant crab. Something with a hard carapace will have some armor. And all of those examples were between 1 and 2. And then, of course, light armor is only going to be 2, and that's like usually a D6 minimum strength. So again, most of the time you're looking at 1 to 2 armor, and that's why you're kind of safe with 1 power point. Now, when we get to the 4 armors, we're talking about like epic beasts, like dragons have 3 to 4 armor, so they don't even have above that. They mostly have 4 armor at the max. And again, that's scales, but they've been upgraded to dragon. Some elites very rarely will have it, like the champion version of a skeleton will have +4 armor. And then medium armor, if something's wearing like, it's usually a +4 in a lot of different settings and systems, settings, or companion books, I should say. When we get into 6 armor, it's so rare. You're talking about legendary creatures like liches, Tarrasques, and sentry beasts. Sentry beasts are just the fantasy guide version of, companion version of Tarrasques. They have 6 armor. And really, really heavy armor, like heavy plate will have that. Now, all of this, of course, is your GM. One of the great things about Savage Worlds is you can just kind of create any creature you want, and it's pretty easy to. So Game Masters can always throw in 6 armored things without it being, without there being kind of a reason to, I guess. But usually there'll be some type of indicator that has armor. So when you are doing that, if you want to spend more than 1 power point, you should really know that the thing that you're fighting or the things that you're fighting have more armor. So something that you've done, like, creature checks beforehand, like in smarts, some type of smarts roll to kind of figure out, oh, they have really heavy armor, or you're fighting against a boss or a sub boss, and you that, okay, we got a raise on this one and not a raise on this one if you're kind of metagamey, but it's Savage Worlds, right? We can be a little metagamey with that stuff, or you just kind of figure it out. Like the Game Master's like, it just doesn't seem like you're penetrating as much. Then you kind of know what to do, but generally I would just most of the time stick to the 1 power point. All right. And armor piercing, I think this is like A level. Kind of borders on B with me, but the one that you can put it on any damage, and that the 1 power point gives you basically a +2 damage against things that have armor. It's really good, right? And it's a really good way to increase your damage. All right. Moving on to fatigue. So fatigue is... it puts a fatigue on a creature. And what fatigue does, it just gives a -1 on all trait rolls, so kind of similar to a wound. The good thing about fatigue is that it stacks with wound penalties and things like distracted. Now, the fatigue modifier cannot cause incapacitation. So if something is, I forget the upgraded version of fatigue, I can't remember right off the top of my head, if they would be fatigued again, then they would usually get incapacitated. But with this universal power mod, you cannot cause incapacitation. Now, here was one that was really, really confusing as far as rules go, right? There was not a clear answer on this. So some of the language in fatigue is much more specific about what it can be applied to. So it can be attached to any power that can cause damage, or it is resisted by the target. If she's affected by the target in any way, then she suffers fatigue. So there's a couple things to break down there. First of all, the resisted is very important because there's a lot of powers that might do something, but they're not actually resisted. So again, if you've heard me talk before, not really like criticisms, I guess, but kind of gripe, I don't know if it's the same thing. With Savage World, sometimes the language isn't so defined, like they don't have a thing where they said, this is what resisted means, this is what being recovered means. But we know, if you go through the book enough, you kind of know what those things mean. So resisted basically means that the target of your power has the ability to stop it from happening immediately. So something like an oppose roll, or something like a roll that you roll and you get a success, and then they get to roll like vigor or spirit, and it wouldn't happen if they succeeded, right? A recovered power is something like you cast it and it does something to them, and then on their turn they get like a free reroll, or a free roll to get out of it. So an example of a resist power is slumber. You get a success, then they get a chance to roll, I think against vigor, to not have it happen. And a recovered power, something like lower trait. You cast lower trait on them, it just works, and then on their turn, they get a roll to automatically shake it off. So that's the first thing to know about with fatigue as far as it going on to someone. Also, when it says it's affected by the power in any way, when we're talking about damage, that means shaken or wounded. It doesn't mean you just hit them. It actually has to cause shaken or something. And then with other powers like debuffs, obviously, it's pretty self-explanatory, it just works. But now with something like when we compare it with the armor piercing about doing damage, right, it's a little bit more confusing. This is, again, there's going to really be up to your game master here, but I would say at least what I think is for sure is that you can't put it on things like smite, right? You're not like, casting it on Smite and then putting on Smite and then casting Smite on somebody would kind of be putting fatigue on them. Now, of course, the game master can disagree with this, or you can disagree with this, but pretty sure that's what Raw is. But I do have a list of like for sure powers that you can use it on. So this is the list. I'll read it kind of quickly, but Banish, Blast, Bolt, Burst, Drain Power Points, Fear, Growth, Shrink, Havoc. That's a iffy one, but should be able to. Intangibility, if you're using it as a debuff. Mind Reading, Mind Wipe, Puppet, Slumber, Silence with the targeted mod, Stun, and Teleport Foe. Teleport with the Teleport Foe turns it into a offensive debuff instead of just a mobility power. So those are the ones that those are the ones that I'm pretty sure, I'll say 99% sure, can definitely work. The ones that I would allow, or I think that Game Master should maybe consider allowing with creativity, are Barrier with a damage mod, Damage Field, Elemental Manipulation when it's used as damage, Smite, Telekinesis. This one would be like when you do something. Same with Elemental Manipulation. It would only, if you damage somebody, it only lasts at the end of the next turn. It doesn't last for the whole power. Yeah. So those are ones that I would recommend people be open to. And again, you have to be creative with this. So if you're a Barrier with the damage mod, it would be something like you have a necromantic bone wall, and there's like skeletal hands that suck life energy out of people, right? That's what I would kind of flavor trap that as. So really the best uses of fatigue, in my opinion, because it is quite expensive at 2 power points. So it's not something just to put willy-nilly. I don't really think it's good on damaging powers, and because it only lasts till the end of the next turn. So instant powers, I don't think it's good on. I also don't think it's definitely not worth doing against extras, really. Even in AoEs most of the time, it's really good against wild cards, and it's good against like maybe sub-bosses that have, that have things like that have a resilient, things like that, and that are like really high skills, like lieutenants or mini bosses, things like that. It's just very expensive. The good thing about it, though, is that it does stack with wound penalties, like I said before, and it's very hard to actually get fatigue as a player, player character onto NPCs. It's very, there's not really hardly any ways to do it. Some of the best uses as far as powers, I think, are intangibility when used as a debuff. Intangibility is an expensive power to use as a debuff. It does kind of just eliminate somebody from the combat for a little bit, but if you are going to use it as a debuff, then you really want to use fatigue. Just spend the extra power points because you're already spending a lot on intangibility. So you really want to make it hard for them to be recovered from, because intangibility, it has the initial resistance, and then there's a recovery too. So you want to make it hard for them. Puppet, it's another one. Puppet is another one that's resisted immediately, and it's an expensive power. But whenever you get them to do something, if you get its normal success when you cast Puppet, they can have a chance to like resist against that. So putting fatigue on it, it does kind of cut down on their combat potential if you're using them to attack other things. But I think it's worth it just to have them to lower the chances of them not listening to you or not doing your commands. And then Slumber is a really, really good one. Just because you cast Slumber, and again, they're resisted and they go down, a loud noise can wake them up with a spirit roll, I think, or a smart, I don't remember which one, but they get to recover from it. That's another one that just kind of locks it down, right? That -1 can do a lot, because all these kind of non-instant debuff powers, the strong modifier was taken away from the last edition for some of them. So this is basically the strong modifier when you add it to these ones. And then finally, if Barrier and Smite, if your GM allows you to do it, are excellent, excellent ways to apply fatigue. All right. And so fatigue, I give a C. It's just okay when you can do it. It can be strong in the right circumstances against bosses, but it's very expensive, I think, for 2 power points, and, has a limited use because of all its specifics, right? Okay. Moving on to Glow. It's Glow Shroud, but we're going to talk about Glow first. It's 1 power point. It gives off, when you apply it to a target, it gives off a soft light and a small burst template around them. And it subtracts 2 from their stealth rolls, and it negates 1 point of illumination penalties for those attacking the glowing character. So here we get into, again, well, fatigue had this language about how it's applied. There's nothing in here that talks about how glow is applied, but we can surmise from fatigue how it works. Basically, it's like fatigue, but it can also be applied to any power that affects somebody. So, unlike fatigue, where lower trait couldn't be used, you could put glow onto, say, lower trait, right? It'd only be lower traits and instant power, so it only lasts for the end of the next turn, but you could put it on lower trait to have them glow. As far as its usage, it's 1 power point. In my opinion, it's pretty much never really, I've never seen it really being used. Like if you really need a light, really, it's not good as a debuff. You can maybe use it in certain circumstances when you don't have any light sources available to you, as a buff, although it will, it negates that penalty, but you're already glowing anyways, right? So it can be used as a buff too in those certain circumstances. And as a debuff, it could potentially be used if you're fighting in darkness, but most of the time, if we're playing in a fantasy game or cyberpunk or sci-fi, there's probably low light vision on some of the people, or people have a flashlight or something. I just think most of the time it's not useful. It's not worth the 1 power point, honestly. So glow, I give a D. But then we're moving on to Shroud. Now, Shroud is, so what does it do? And as far as glow, as far as the -2 from stealth rolls, that's just stupid as far as the debuff. If you see the creature, you're not going to need to negate their stealth penalties because you've already seen them. So it's so niche. Anyways, so Shroud. Shroud dims and slightly obscures the target, is how they call it. So the attacks against her suffer a -1 penalty, and she adds +1 to stealth rolls. So it does 2 things. Both of them are extremely useful. If you saw my stealth video, I talked about Shroud a lot because it is a good way to buff up certain powers to give yourself pseudo invisibility for less price. And stealth is stealth on its own. It's not a huge thing. It's just +1 to stealth, but stealth is a huge part of exploration. So this is still very useful just to add that little bonus to stealth, because when you want to sneak, right? If you're scouting, you don't want to be discovered. So every little bit helps with stealth. And if that's all it did, it might just be okay for the 1 power point, but that it does that as well as subtracting -1 on attacks. That's attacks. That's melee and ranged, and is crazy good. It should be used. It's one of the best things that you can put on any single type of buff power, any power you're casting on you and your allies. If you think about it, it's basically it's a half-priced a deflection that you got with a raise, because deflection costs 2 power points, and it gives a -2 on either melee or range attacks. Unless you get a raise, then it's both. And so Shroud gives you the same bonus, but automatically gives you against both melee and range, and for only half the price. And it actually can stack with deflection. So Shroud is S tier. This is the only one that's S tier. You should be considering using it on pretty much every power as long as it makes sense with your trappings. But you can get very creative with this. You shouldn't just get stuck in, shadows or darkness. Like if you're a weather mage, right? It could be fog or clouds. Or if you control sands, it could be dust clouds. If you control, nanobots, it could be just a shroud of nanos reflecting light or illusions. It goes on and on, right? If you're a nature mage, it could be tiny little iridescent insects, whatever. So you can get very creative with it. So I think you should, if you're creative enough, you should be able to apply it to any trapping. S tier. Always consider using it on even just yourself or other people or one person, doesn't matter. 1 power point, S tier. Okay. Moving on to Heavy Weapon. Heavy Weapon is a 2 power point mod. So Heavy Weapon basically makes your attack considered a heavy weapon. Now, what does that mean? Well, basically, Heavy Weapon negates heavy armor. Heavy armor is a thing that some things can have. Sometimes really powerful creatures can have it. Also things like tanks, stuff like that. It basically means that if something isn't a heavy weapon, then you can't do damage to it. So it just makes sense that a tank, can't be, a .22 rifle can't destroy a tank, right? With a bunch of explosions in the dice. So that's kind of what it helps. You see this a lot in Rifts and some other high-powered games like superheroes too. Heavy Weapon just, there's not much to say about it. When you need it, you need it. If you're going in, if you want to attack a tank, if you attack something, you realize it has heavy armor, you use it. So Heavy Weapon to me is a C power mod, right? It just, when you need it, you need it. There's not much to say about it. All right. Moving on to Hinder Hurry. Hinder Hurry is another 1 point. They're together, but they do 2 different things. They're another 1 power point mod. So Hinder is you're slowing the target in some way. You know, again, they give samples like intense cold, slippery surface, whatever. Basically, it reduces the base pace of the target by 2 until the power expires. Again, if this is an instant power, it lasts until the end of the next turn. If it's one that lasts longer, it's the same as what we talked about with glow, right? What it can be applied to. So Hinder, you know, it's okay. It's good on if you're in very large maps and you're facing, say, a lot of melee enemies, or you're trying to flee from like a group, right? It's good to kind of do an AoE with Hinder on it, just to, you know, it's 2 pace, but 2 pace can make a big difference, right? Positioning is very important, and pace can be very important for that. But that it's like most of the debuff powers are instant, so it just really doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't get much. It's not as much of a game changer as some of the other debuffs that we've talked about. You know, like even fatigue and of course Shroud. I mean, of course, yeah, you'll see. Anyways, so yeah, it's just okay. It's a C for me. It's just, you just kind of use it occasionally. Hurry on the other hand is pretty actually good. Not as good as Shroud, but pretty good for a buff mod. It adds +2 to your something's pace. And I really think that's just more impactful to do it on players than to put it on enemies most of the time. Again, positioning is very important. It's very important for your, you know, ranged and arcane casters to get into range, not have to run, right, to cast something or to get out of danger. So hurry to me is a B level. It's something that you could do a good amount of the time, you know, especially if you're in a smaller map, it might not be useful, but yeah, it can be good. Now, for both of them, they do stack with sloth or speed. How you do the math on that is that you apply the mod first. So if you're casting speed on your friend and you want to put hurry on top of it, you would add +2 to their pace. So usually pace of 6, you add 2 to 8, and then you would double it for 16. Same with sloth. You would just, you know, -2 from 6 to 4, and then you divide it by 2 to make 2 pace. So they stack. You just apply the mod first. All right. And the one last thing to know about it, they changed it, is that neither of these are cumulative anymore. They used to be, so you can't stack them over again. So if you have, you know, one person casting a power with Hinder on it on an enemy, and then another person does, it's not just going to keep stacking until they can't move at all. It only gets applied no matter what the source is one time. All right. Moving on to lingering damage. Oh boy. I feel like lingering damage, and people might disagree with me on this one. Lingering damage is one I see people use a bunch, and I never really see it being as good as people want it to. A big part of the madness for me is that it costs 2 power points, and it doesn't work with things like smite, right? It only works with just the direct damage powers, kind of, and it doesn't actually increase duration. So I saw people before trying to use it to maybe like increase the duration of a power, maybe for something like, you know, using fatigue, like stacking fatigue and lingering damage, to think that, oh, maybe then fatigue will last another round. It doesn't do that, right? The base power is always going to be an instant power. Lingering damage doesn't increase the duration. It just has an effect that lasts. It doesn't increase the base duration. So that's if you think that's like a loophole, it's not. It's not allowed raw. Anyways, so what does it do? On the next turn, if you hit somebody with a damaging power, you don't actually have to like cause damage necessarily. You just have to like hit. The target suffers the same damage again, just with 1 less die. It goes down a step. So a 2d6 bolt will go down to 2d4 the next round. So yeah, it just doesn't, 2d4, you're not using this on, it's a 2 PowerPoint mod, so you're not really going to want to use this on, you know, extras, like little weak extras, right? And you're not going to want to use this on really tough things, like a tough boss, because 2d4 is usually not going to do that much damage most of the time. And for the cost, you know, all the damage powers have the damage mod that also casts 2 power points, and that adds a d6 to the base damage. And I just think that is, if you have to decide between the two, right, the damage mod is going to be way more value for your power points than lingering damage is. You're just going to, most of the time, that's going to give you more damage than the next round kind of 2d4. But if you do want to use it We definitely want to only use it on powers that do 2d6 at least, not things like, Havoc or something that does 2d4, right? It's just not worth it, because when something's already a d4, you lose a die, and so it goes to like 1d4 and whatever. That's just too weak. If you do want to use it, then use it on a damage power that you've already boosted with the damage mod. So it's a guaranteed at least 3d6. So you want it to be at least 3d6 of damage, maybe 4d6, right? Going at them, because in that case, then it's 3d4. Then you're more in the range of actually causing damage. The times that it is good against are sub bosses or bosses that are not very tough, but are kind of hard to hit. So if you get that hit off on them, you manage to get that hit off, right? You succeeded on your attack roll, then it gives you another chance to do damage to them. So that's when it's good. I still give it a D, but it can be effective when you're fighting, like, say if you're fighting, like, I don't know, a fairy or something, I don't know, like a small, tiny thing that's darting around, and you're like, oh, it's so annoying to hit, but it has, like, a wet fart could take it down. Maybe that's your trappings. I don't know. You have a wet fart arcane background. But if that could take it down, right, the lingering stench does enough damage to it to take it down. I don't know where I'm going with this. Anyway, so yeah, that's where it's good, but D in my opinion. Okay, moving on to range. Now, range in the next one, these are the ones that are the true, I would say, universal power modifiers, just because these increase the flexibility of arcane casters so much. And I see people forget that they're able to do this. Now, with range, for 1 power point, it doubles the range of the base power, and for 2 power points, it triples the range. And this can just be so important. I mean, often it's better, in my opinion, to spend the 1 power point than to try to run. I have my own kind of rules with run, right? I'll usually allow max run die, but still that -2 to maybe not even get in range anyways, it's just not worth it. I'd rather spend the 1 power point or even 2 power points. If I really want to do a power on something, then this is so worth it. So there's not really much to talk about here. Just you can't do it with if a touch range. So if you made the power like with a limitation of touch, you then can't be like, oh, I use range to kind of change it. No, if it has the range of touch, you can't use it. You can't use it on cones, and you cannot use it on the new streams, which I'm not sure if they're in the Suede book yet. But it's the stream one where it's like it's more of like a line spell than the cone, which is a cone. So yeah, it can't be used for those things. But yeah, it's an A+. It's an A power because it's not you're not using it all the time, but it's just so good and so flexible, and the price is right that it's an A power mod for me. Okay. Moving on to the last one, we have Selective. It's also a power point, just like range. It really, really increases the versatility of all your powers. It really should only apply to things that have a blast template. I mean, that's kind of how it's written. But what does it do? It basically, anything within its kind of sphere of influence, right? You can decide who it affects and who it's not. So the classic example is you launch a fireball, right? You launch a blast, and your allies are fighting with some enemies, and you just put 1 power point on, call it Selective, and it creates pockets of air where your allies aren't affected, and they don't have to roll damage or anything. So yeah, really, really important, especially if arcane casting is your main thing and you're focused on damage or debuffing. It just really ups that flexibility. And with Selective, I think you can get very, you can be very creative with it, right? So things like barriers, things like illusion. I mean, it's kind of, again, you might rule it a different way, but it's not clear whether something like an illusion can be used with Selective, whether you can cast an illusion over an area and then automatically make it so your friends can't see, or you cast invisibility, right? Can your allies see each other? You can probably do Selective with that. It's not totally clear, but I encourage game masters to let their players be creative with it and to open it up to more stuff, like invisibility, or like maybe even a barrier. Maybe if you made a barrier that's a fire barrier, right? Much like the fireball, you say, oh, I've kind of keyed it to my allies, and they can, it'll open it up for them, right? I have enough control to kind of recognize their auras or something, and that the firewall opens up for them. So yeah, you can be very creative with it, but beyond just like the blasts and the bursts, right? So yeah, Selective, it's a B because it's not something that's used all the time as much as even range, but it's really, really solid. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it as far as all that stuff. I hope you guys got out of it. I mean, if you watch it this far, I hope you got something out of it. Again, I mean, even with the caveats and what have you and the rule stuff, the ambiguity, I really, really encourage creativity as far as when these can be applied. And, don't be disappointed if your game master says no, because it isn't clear and it really goes to their rulings. But, if you're using your trappings in fun and interesting ways in the environment, then I think there is kind of open to interpretation a lot of these. But anyways, that was the episode. This is Tabletop Tango. I was your host, Eric, and happy gaming.
Savage World, one of the best games today. Savage World, Benny.